Hi, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural AntiTribe Government Sex Predators podcast, the joint podcast that we're engaging in. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm monitoring the live chat. It says that I have full bars on my microphone. But in today's episode, we're going to be examining recent revelations about ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt's appearance at the Sinai Temple, including his claims that the ADL trains 40,000 law enforcement officers annually, that it reports speech that it finds objectionable to the FBI, and it has 50,000 attorneys ready to sue anyone engaging in speech that the ADL doesn't like or that it finds objectionable. And the ADL apparently has an AI monitoring tool that it uses to canvass the internet to find speech. I hope I'm on that tool or I've been picked up by that tool. But that AI monitoring tool canvasses the internet to find speech that the ADL deems objectionable, and then it passes speech to its network of 50,000 attorneys and the FBI. And if the attorneys find anything actionable, they then sue the person who's engaging in constitutionally protected speech. This is lawfare at its finest. We're going to be examining how the FBI or how the ADL got into trouble in the 90s for this same type of behavior. Ironically, in San Francisco, California, where the district attorney Arlo Smith basically was bringing charges against them, which he shortly dropped after he brought them. So we're also going to be examining 2020 law in California, Senate Bill 145, which was sponsored by Scott Wiener, a gay Jewish legislator in California, who's been at the forefront of all sorts of sex crime reform and legislation. And we're going to overview that. And so, what Senate Bill 145 did was it sought to give California judges the discretion to waive the requirement for sex offender registration for an offender between 24 and 7 or between 24 and 27 years of age, and their victim of 14 to 17 years of age. Now, this is in the event that the offender engaged in oral or anal sex with their victim. So, in the Soviet Socialist Republic of California, the judges could waive the requirement that a sex offender who had sex with a 14 to 17-year-old, statutory rape, if the sex was in question was vaginal sex, they could waive the sex offender registry requirement. And this is because California believes, and I quote, that a 14-year-old can engage in, quote, voluntary sex with a 24-year-old. So if the sex was voluntary, why is the sex a crime at all? If it's really voluntary, if a 14-year-old child can voluntarily engage in sex with an adult, why are we criminalizing such conduct in the first place? Is statutory rape. That's right. That's the level. 14-year-olds lack the requisite mental and physical or legal capacity to truly consent with an adult, especially a 24-year-old man. So that's the age gap under the law, 10 years of age. So up to 24 years of age if you're 14 and you engage in, quote, voluntary sex with a 24-year-old. The judge in California had the discretion, if it was vaginal sex, to waive the sex offender registry requirement. So, because the law in the Soviet Socialist Republic of California gave judges the discretion to waive the sex offender registry requirement for vaginal sex, Senator Scott Wiener, a gay Jewish man in California who's married to another man, saw his opening to expand the waiver to include anal and oral sex for 24-year-old gay adult males who rape 14-year-old boys. I'm sorry, the politically correct term is voluntary statutory rape. I don't want to be homophobic. I don't want to be bigoted. Because adult males can engage in voluntary statutory rape of a 14 to 17-year-old boy or girl. That's California in 2020, folks. Senate Bill 145 passed both houses of California's legislature, and it was signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom on September 11th, 2020. That's the level. Gavin Newsom didn't object and say it was absurd to characterize vaginal sex between a 14-year-old girl and a 24-year-old male as voluntary, and ask California legislators to remove the judiciary's description for that form of child rape. He simply signed the legislation expanding the discretion to anal and oral rape between gay men and their child victims. Now, to give you an idea of why that's problematic, I mean, in addition to the aforementioned issues with whether or not a 14-year-old can truly consent to voluntary sex with a 24-year-old or someone who is legally classified as an adult, it's within the 10-year gap. So between 18 and 24, you would be off the hook. Your judge could waive the sex offender registry requirement. No one would know that you had ever done this. In addition, the issue is that it's apples and oranges. Men who have sex with men, that's the CDC's politically correct term, they account for 53% of all new HIV infections annually in the United States, according to the CDC's data. They account for over 80% of all new syphilis infections annually. A substantial portion of all other sexually transmitted infections and diseases are also accounted for by the gay male community. And so ultimately, there's a reason we at Government Sex Predators, AntiTribe, and Investigations in Ritual Abuse oppose the concept of statutory rape. Rape is rape. It's pretty black and white. So if I sit here and I say that a child is incapable of consenting to entering into or honoring contracts, that's not controversial. It's why we don't allow 14-year-olds to borrow money from banks or apply for credit cards. We don't let them go into the workforce to be exploited by employers who would likely utilize them as full-time serfs if they could. We don't do that because we recognize that they have a diminished capacity mentally, and so consequently, we draw a line in the law about the cognitive capacity of a child, that is someone under 18, and we don't let that happen. We don't let them be exploited. We don't let children be exploited by employers or banks. We don't let them apply for credit cards. We don't let them borrow money from banks. The reality is banks and employers would exploit children if we as a society allowed them to do so. If it were legal, they don't have any morality about it. They don't have any scruples about it. And we know this from history because that's exactly what they did historically. They used children as low-cost labor in factories and slaughterhouses and wherever else they could, and that's why we have laws against child labor today. It's why we have workplace safety laws, because we know that if left to their own devices, employers, shareholders, corporations, they would exploit people. They don't have morals. They don't have scruples. They just have one concern, and that is a concern for the profit margin. So it's why the law recognizes a difference between a child and an adult with respect to every other facet of society and culture. It's why we insist that parents don't get to sell their children into indentured servitude or labor contracts to satisfy the debts of the parents. That used to happen until we passed laws against it to protect children from that type of exploitation by adults. However, in California, in the Soviet Socialist Republic of California, when a child is exploited by a 19 to 24-year-old man, the judges in that state now have the expanded discretion to waive the sex offender registry requirement because voluntary statutory rape, that's the phrase that they use. The sex is voluntary. So voluntary statutory rape is a thing in California. So Gavin Newsom is your presumptive Democratic presidential nominee in 2028. And this is the legislation he signed into law back in 2020. So this is the future he wants and the Democratic Party wants for your 14 to 17-year-old son or daughter. They're public about it. That a 19 to 27-year-old daughter or adult who entices them in oral or vaginal or anal sex likely won't have to register as a sex offender because the statutory rape was consensual. Even though your child can't legally consent to an adult, borrow money from a bank, apply for a credit card, because they have a diminished capacity, they can't really consent to these things, and they're not going to honor a contract, which is why we have a fucking statutory rape law on the books to begin with. So, I mean, this isn't the only legislation like this that Senator Scott Wiener has authored or sponsored or passed into law or helped pass into law in the state of California. He's been at the vanguard of sex crimes legislation throughout his career. To give you another example, in 2022, he sponsored Senate Bill 357, the Safer Streets for All Act. Get this. This barred police from arresting hookers for loitering for prostitution and enabled those previously convicted or arrested of that crime to apply to clear their convictions from the record. That effectively made the police's job more difficult with respect to hookers and whores. I mean, I refuse to concede the semantic ground by calling them sex workers, because even though it's clear that whores are loitering on certain sidewalks and streets to sell sex, the police actually had to witness you taking cash in exchange for sex, or they had to catch you agreeing to engage in whoredom or engaging in whore conduct. That is, having sex with one of your poor hoppers. Because I will now introduce my lexicographical innovation to the discussion by saying that whore hoppers, the customers of whores, should be thrown in prison. And I want to explain that. Whore hoppers and their whores have created a public health crisis. It is not a victimless crime. Every study that has been done has found a positive relationship between whore arrest and STI rates. We have 20 million new STI infections in the United States every year. 1 in 6 people have some variant of herpes. And whore hoppers are a minority in this country, but they are a significant vector of disease. That's why gay men, who are at most 4 to 5% of the population, account for 53% of all new HIV infections in this country annually, and over 80% of all new syphilis infections in this country annually. And now they can stay off the sex offender registry, so no one has any clue that they were previously convicted of having sex with a 14-year-old, as long as they were within the 10-year range. They could be between 24 and 27, or they could be between 18 and 27, as long as their victim was between 14 and 17. And the judges in California have the ability, thanks to the California legislature, and Gavin Newsom to waive the sex offender registry requirement, which is there for a reason, to provide prior notice to everyone, hey, this guy's a pervert, whether it's vaginal, oral, or anal sex with a child, that's what he is. There's no such thing as voluntary sex between an adult and a child. The reason we have a statutory rape law in the books is because a child lacks the capacity to consent to sex with an adult. And so you have this public health crisis in the country, and it's created by a substantial or by a small minority of people in terms of spreading STIs and STDs. Many of these individuals, they go home to their spouses who have no idea what's going on, and they contract a disease as a result of their spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend's behavior. And, they're just bad people. And the rest of us shouldn't have to see our tax dollars diverted to pay for antibiotics to treat whore hoppers and whores for STIs and STDs. But we do, because the thing about whore hoppers and whores is that they just don't give a shit about the public interest. They're in it for themselves, and they expect you to pay for it when the consequences of their own actions catch up to them. They expect you to make an exception for them. So if you whore hoppers or whores are loitering about on public sidewalks or cruising down public streets, you should be accosted by the police. Public sidewalks are not open-air vending machines for pussy. They're just not. They're not open-air vending machines for gay sex. They're for legal transit by the public. It's how we walk from place to place. And ultimately, we shouldn't have to walk around whores to get to where we're going, just like we shouldn't have to walk around drug dealers and whatnot. Or anyone else who's engaged in criminal conduct on a public sidewalk. The police should be able to accost you if you're loitering there in your clear intention, and we all know how whores dress. We all know how drug dealers behave on the sidewalks. None of us should have to navigate that as law-abiding citizens on a public sidewalk, or we shouldn't have to drive through it on a public street when traffic has increased to a certain area, because guess what? There are whores and whore hoppers there. There are drug dealers and their customers there. And this might seem obvious to the majority of you watching this, but to Senator Scott Wiener and other smooth-brained people, it isn't obvious at all. These are the people who repeat mantras like sex work is real work and trans women are real women and Black Lives Matter. I mean, lives matter. Before that phrase came into vogue, no one seriously argued about whether or not lives mattered unless they were an ethno-supremacist, a bigot, or a pro-infanticide fanatic who argued that an unborn child wasn't a person at all with rights, so that you could exterminate them before they were even born. Or, someone like Lindsey Graham when he has a gay war boner with some podunk Middle Eastern country. Everyone knows biological women with 2 X chromosomes are women. This is not a hard concept to grasp or to regurgitate. No one is disputing that whore work is work. Because if you've seen the average whore hopper, the average person who patronizes whores, no amount of money can fairly compensate a whore for servicing that sexually. And that's the thing. Our public sidewalks and public places are not open markets for whores, male or female, to sell pussy or sexual favors. And our police are justified in clearing those sidewalks of any loiterers who even appear to be on the sidewalks for purposes of illegal behavior. So much so that certain areas of our cities and towns are a no-go area for law-abiding citizens. And instead of making it easier for the police to serve the public interest by clearing out our citizens, these two, Scott Wiener and Gavin Newsom, have decided to make it more difficult, because ultimately neither one of them really believes that whoring should be a crime at all. They don't believe prostitution should be a criminal act. Sex work is real work. Ah, that kind of bullshit. And so Scott Wiener he seeks to, and is ultimately succeeded at, making California even more of a shithole than it already is. So now he and Gavin Newsom want your children to be sexually exploited by adults. That's the first law we covered, this idea of the sex between the 14-year-old and the 24-year-old was voluntary, so the 24-year-old shouldn't have to register as a sex offender. The judge should have the discretion to waive that requirement. Who are these people? It's why people behind them have introduced the concept of this, voluntary statutory rape. In statutory rape itself, rather than just calling it what it is, which is child rape, they've introduced these other terms into the legal lexicon where it pertains to a judge's discretion to waive the sex offender requirement, or the sex offender registry requirement, for vaginal and now anal and oral sex with a 14-year-old boy or girl by a 24-year-old woman or man. That's why these people have introduced legislation that bars the police from clearing the sidewalks of those who seek to turn public sidewalks into open-air pussy and crack and meth markets. For that matter, I'm not even getting into the effect of allowing drug and pussy dealers to conduct illegal businesses on sidewalks, what effect that has on traffic or real estate values, or the tax base in those neighborhoods in terms of property taxes, which that tax base is used to fund essential services like education, public school, the police, the fire department, so on and so forth. I mean, hell, it has a deleterious effect, and everybody knows it. And any private citizen who's unfortunate enough to live in these neighborhoods with their families, that is, their wives and their children, or their husbands and their children, and they object to living amongst an open-air pussy and drug market conducted on public sidewalks, they'll face violent reprisals, because here's the thing about drug dealers and pimps and whores. They will use violence to suppress any resistance to their businesses, even if it involves a simple phone call to the police to report an open-air pussy and drug market in their neighborhood on a public sidewalk that you're supposed to be able to use as a law-abiding citizen. I mean, there are entire areas of our cities that are no-go zones because of legislation like this. Period. And that's the America that these people want for you and your children. That's the America that they're seeking to legislate and impose on you and your children. That's the future in America that they hope to realize in 2028, when the Democratic Party will likely nominate Gavin Newsom as their presidential candidate. The reason I'm using this podcast is a joint podcast between government sex predators and AntiTribe is an overlapping theme. Scott Wiener is a Jewish gay man who was married to another man. We're on any number of platforms owned by Jewish interests who favor the normalization of deviancy, so much so that I recently had an IRA episode taken down for highlighting the absurdity of their positions on sex and gender. So, part 2 of our episode on sex and gender absurdity, which was IRA episode 108, was taken down for hate speech. And fortunately, my appeal of that decision was successful, so it's back up. But as I've reviewed on prior episodes of AntiTribe and prior articles on AntiTribe and IRA, what do you expect from a group of people who believe that Adam was created as a hermaphrodite, with Eve facing the opposite direction, until God caused Adam to fall into a deep slumber, split him in two so that he could have a helpmate? You could find all of this in Midrash Genesis Rabbah 8:1 and the Talmud Yevamot 64a. The Talmud's explication of gender extends to categories like tum-tum or androgyny or aonlit or hermaphroditism. And this is why the Jewish people have been at the forefront of every socially liberal movement to normalize transgenderism, to use hermaphroditism as their basis for normalizing it. And don't get me wrong, like there are things like Klinefelter syndrome, but those things affect an infinitesimally small number of people in the population. Gender dysphoria, at most, before it became a social contagion, affected 700,000 Americans in a population of what, 350 million? It was an extreme minority. It was a disorder. It was classified as a disorder, still is in the DSM, until, of course, these people get a hold of the DSM and they butcher it the way they butchered the DSM to normalize homosexuality and say that it's not intrinsically disordered sexuality. They got a hold of sexual orientation as a concept. They created an entire construct of it. No one's saying that it isn't normal to have like a spectrum of sexual attraction. What we're saying is it's a problem if you act on that attraction. So if you're attracted to children and you act on it, that's a problem. Pedophilia itself is a problem. It's intrinsically disordered. To be attracted to a child is not normal. Like, period. Child has no secondary sexual characteristics. Something is wrong with your cognition and your psyche. At the end of the day, these things, you have to understand, like, from a Jewish perspective, God is a hermaphrodite. And fusing the two extremes of male and female by surgically and hormonally transitioning a male and a female, a male to a female and vice versa, it ties back to Jewish theosophy. There's Jewish beliefs about the nature of God and who God is. Most of the goy watching this episode don't realize that, and that's because Google and other tools you might use to locate such information deliberately bury that information in their search algorithms so that you Gentiles won't be able to access it. That, in their hope to turn you into a whore hopper by bombarding you with pornography or sexualized imagery on social media and in popular culture. And most of you perverts have been sitting in front of your computer not to access useful or practical information like this podcast. Instead, you're using the internet for what it was always intended to do. It's to enable average people to lapse into sexual deviance and stupidity. You might not be having actual oral, vaginal, or anal intercourse with 14-year-old girls or boys, but you're definitely looking at those actors and entertainers in that age range online or on social media, and some of you are responding to that stimulus in a prurient manner. I mean, the first time I became aware of like grown men being attracted to young girls, like as a cultural phenomenon, was when Britney Spears came up, and she was clearly depicting a high school age girl or a teenage girl in her little Catholic schoolgirl outfit. And you had all these 30, 40-year-old men saying they'd have sex with her. Now, at the time that she became popular and that song of hers blew up, launched her in the mainstream, she was 18. But it was still what the image that she was portraying as someone who was under 18. And that's what I'm talking about. That's what this media and entertainment apparatus seeks to market to you, is this idea that you should ultimately engage in this kind of behavior. You should ultimately embrace the normalization of children as sexual beings. You should behave like either an outright pedophile or an ephebophile, that is somebody who's attracted to children between, like, what, 12 and 14? Or, well, hebophile is 12 to 14. Ephebophile is 14 to 17. And that's what they're trying to normalize. That's why they push these child entertainers towards you, to appeal to your prurient interest, to sexualize them, and also to make money, because they don't have any scruples about how they make money. As I said earlier, if we let them, they'd have 12-year-olds on OnlyFans. Right now, they have 12 to 16 to 17-year-olds on this site called Brand Army, which Sean Ryan on his podcast highlighted as OnlyFans for teenagers. And it is a gateway to OnlyFans, make no mistake about it. But, of course, 12 to 17-year-olds can't be on OnlyFans, so they can be on Brand Army. And they can be sexualized and marketed to you in the manner I've outlined in this episode. So even if you're not having sex with a 12 to 17-year-old, they're trying to get you to look at them in a sexual light, in the way that they market them, in the way that they portray them in popular culture. Now, investigations in ritual abuse, government sex predators, and AntiTribe are seditious outlets, in that I seek to undermine the very purpose of the internet by exposing what people like Scott Wiener and their useful goy idiots like Gavin Newsom are doing in opposing it. In that, and publicizing what Zionist, Talmudic Jews, Kabbalistic Jews actually believe and practice, and promote as their motivation for peddling filth in normalizing deviancy and criminal sexual conduct. They are breaking your society down from the inside. They're being aided and abetted by this oxymoronic group that calls itself Zionist Christians, because they don't want you Gentiles to have a functioning society. They don't want you to be able to walk down a public, taxpayer-funded sidewalk in your city without encountering whores or whore hoppers or drug dealers or junkies or homeless mentally ill people or in other forms of human waste. They don't want your children protected from 24-year-old sexual deviants who have sex with 14-year-olds, because they don't want those 24-year-old perverts thrown in the sex offender registry for anally violating your son or daughter. And when they see a disparity between vaginal child rape and anal rape with respect to a sex offender, they see it as like homophobic, because anal rape is what's perpetuated by 24-year-old gay men on 14-year-old gay boys. And so if the heterosexual who vaginally rapes a 14-year-old girl gets off the hook in terms of a judge having the discretion to waive the sex offender requirement, their answer to that isn't to say, oh, wait a sec, that's disgusting, we should remove the discretion for the heterosexual offender as it pertains to judges being able to waive that requirement. No, what they do is they say, well, that's not fair to the gay child predator. And they then ultimately seek to give the judge the discretion to waive the requirement for a sex offender registration for a 24 to 27-year-old who anally rapes a 14 to 17-year-old. Because in their minds, the sex was voluntary. Well, if it's voluntary, if you really believe that, why do you have a statutory rape law at all? This blurs the lines, because if and when a minor victim comes forward and accuses an adult offender of rape, that adult offender falls back on the sex was voluntary. And you're in a gray area. And while he may still be convicted of statutory rape under strict liability, he will not be on the sex offender registry. he's not going to suffer that lifelong stigma. He's not going to be known as a sexual predator as long as he's between 24 and 27 or 18 and 27, and his victim isn't beyond 10 years younger than him. I mean, they don't want to close this loophole for heterosexual offenders. They want to expand the loophole so that gay men can squeeze into your child and through the sex offender registry requirement when they face a judge during sentencing. So, I mean, this episode is probably going to get removed from YouTube, and we'll get a channel strike for saying all of this. But you can view our content on Rumble and Gab and elsewhere. And I have to issue the requisite disclaimer here. Not all Jews, but enough of them, engage in this sort of nonsense to warrant severing their influence over our policy, our laws, our financial system, our culture, and giving them what they purport to want by sending them to Israel, which the Jews proudly advertise as the gayest country in the Middle East. You can look it up. Google doesn't censor those search results. So, our next topic in this joint podcast is ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt, who is the gift that keeps on giving. So, you see this bald-headed prick up in the upper left-hand corner right now. And this is Jonathan Greenblatt. He's the head of the ADL. And he's come into the news for the wrong reasons over the past couple of weeks because he gave an address at the Sinai Temple in California in which he said that the ADL has 40 analysts working 24/7, 365 to peruse the internet to identify speech that they find objectionable. He also said that the ADL has an AI tool that canvasses the internet to find objectionable speech that the ADL subjectively classifies as anti-Semitic. They're monitoring the anti-war crazies. They're monitoring the pro-Palestinian crazies. I mean, think about the cognitive dissonance there. The anti-war crazies. According to Jonathan Greenblatt, if you're anti-war, you're crazy. Most of us watching this do not laud or extol war. For obvious reasons. Like the cost is horrific. But the anti-war crazies are being monitored by the ADL. Their speech, their online speech, is being monitored by the ADL. Purportedly in that same speech that he gave, he said that the ADL was monitoring bank transactions. He didn't elaborate how they were doing that. But we're going to give you an idea of what this speech said. Here's a little snippet. Norman Finkelstein posted it. And so we're going to go into this. And so you should.
So number one, we measure and track. Number two, we monitor and disrupt. We have a whole apparatus. I have 40 analysts working full time, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, monitoring extremists. We monitor them online, social media, messaging apps, video games, cryptocurrency, podcasts, short form video, Wikipedia, LLMs. We monitor these people and we share the intelligence with the FBI. You saw last month, you heard about the thing that happened at Wilshire Boulevard Temple. Our analysts investigated what happened. They said they were Koreatown for Palestine, this group of people. They weren't. We were able to ascertain they were from a group called the Turtle Island Liberation Front. Turtle Island is how left-wing activists refer to the United States. They don't call it America, they call it Turtle Island. Like the Iranians call it the Zionist entity, right? They won't call it by its name. The Turtle Island Liberation Front, we gave them a whole dossier. What is Turtle Island Liberation Front? What are their ideas, their goals? Who are they? We identified the people who were in the synagogue. This was on Wednesday, December the 10th. On Monday, December the 15th, this is going to ring a bell. Kash Patel announced they cracked a terror ring where they arrested 4 people who were planning New Year's Eve bombings. Turtle Island Liberation Front. At least one of the people I know for certain was in the building at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, vandalizing it and disrupting the event.
I go back to our previous scene. I'm not talking about that history. I'm not talking about the Leo Frank case. I'm talking about something entirely different. I'm talking about the ADL paying a retired law enforcement officer who then purchased confidential police files from law enforcement individuals so that the ADL could run its own nationwide spying program. This happened in the late 80s and early 90s. And it was illegal. I want to read the coverage of it in the Los Angeles Times. This is an article by Richard C. Paddock. Evidence of ADL spy operations seized by police. It's April 9th, 1993. And let's see, am I still muted? Don't believe I'm muted. I saw Richard notify me in the chat. Let's see. Yep, my Yeti's still popping off. So I shouldn't be muted. But I may have been muted by the Greenblatt video at the Sinai Temple. So anyway, I want to get into this article in the Los Angeles Times. Evidence of ADL spy operation seized by the police. It was posted in 1993, April 9th, 1993 to be exact. And I'll read it for you verbatim. Police on Thursday served search warrants on the Anti-Defamation League here and in Los Angeles. Here is San Francisco. And in Los Angeles, seizing evidence of a nationwide intelligence network accused of keeping files on more than 950 political groups, newspapers, and labor unions, and as many as 12,000 people. Describing the spy operation in great detail, San Francisco authorities simultaneously released voluminous documents telling how operatives of the ADL searched through the trash and infiltrated organizations to gather intelligence on Arab American, right-wing, and what they called, quote, pinko, end quote, organizations. Representatives of the ADL, a well-known organization in the U.S. Jewish community dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism, declined detailed comment Thursday but denied breaking any laws. Police allege that the organization maintains undercover operatives to gather political intelligence in at least 7 cities, including Los Angeles and San Francisco. Groups that were the focus of the spy operation span this political spectrum, including such groups as the Ku Klux Klan, the White Aryan Resistance, Operation Rescue, Greenpeace, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the United Farm Workers, and the Jewish Defense League. Also on the list were Mills College, the board of directors of the San Francisco public television station KQED, in the San Francisco Bay Guardian newspaper. People who were subjects of the spy operation included former Republican Representative Pete McCloskey, jailed political extremist Lyndon H. LaRouche, and Los Angeles Times foreign correspondent Scott Kraft, who is based in South Africa. Authorities said much of the material collected by the group was confidential information obtained illegally from law enforcement agencies. They also alleged that data on some individuals and organizations was sold separately to the South African government. So, this is the ADL in 1993. Now, shortly afterwards, it turns out that Arlo Smith, who had brought the original charges against the ADL, after the police raided the ADL's offices and seized evidence of this illegal spy operation whereby one of the operatives that the ADL hired at $550 a month was bribing retired and active police officers to turn over confidential files, he dropped the case against them. And the ADL's longtime undercover agent is the way I put it. Like, he's a criminal. His name is Roy Bullock. Roy Bullock was absolved of any crime by Arlo Smith, the San Francisco district attorney at the time. And the reason for that is obvious. Arlo Smith didn't want to piss off the Jewish community. So you can look at the Washington Report on Middle Eastern Affairs, or Middle East Affairs, and Rochelle Marshall. She posted an article in January 1994. Headline's pretty classic. ADL didn't do anything wrong and promises to never do it again. Well, as you just saw, they're doing it now. You just saw Jonathan Greenblatt say, hey, we have a nationwide intelligence operation that monitors the speech of others on the internet. That's what they admit to. They're scraping the internet for speech that they may find objectionable. They train 40,000 law enforcement officers a year. They turn over any speech that they find truly objectionable to the FBI, which is not supposed to be policing speech at all. It's limited by the First Amendment as a federal agency when it comes to policing speech or trying to harass and intimidate people who engage in speech that they find objectionable. So you can imagine the effect it has on people when a couple of FBI agents show up to your door and want to ask you about an internet post. Like how intimidating that is. And how scary and frightening that is. Ultimately, it's done to chill the exercise of free speech, and that's not supposed to happen here in these United States. So the ADL entered into a plea agreement to have the charges dropped. They agreed to contribute up to $50,000 to a reward fund for hate crimes. That's not a punishment for them. They love the idea of a hate crime. Like, all crimes are hate crimes. You have to hate the person you're stealing from, or you're robbing, or you're murdering, or you're raping. There's an element of hate involved in all of it. You're just saying, hey, I dislike you so much, and I want whatever it is that you have so much, be it physical possession, an asset, or sex, that I'm going to violate the law and I'm going to violate you and your property. But hey, the ADL got to contribute $50,000 to a reward fund for hate crimes. They spent another $25,000 on a program to teach school children about the evils of violence and discrimination. So they basically got to spend their own money indoctrinating children with their ideology. All of the files seized by police from the ADL and Bullock will be returned to them. Think about that. Roy Bullock was going around bribing police, like retired and active police officers and employees, to turn over confidential police files to him. And the ADL got all those files back. So ADL's official Abraham Foxman, Melvin Sahlberg, crowed that the district attorney's decision confirms our, quote, consistent position that the ADL is engaged in no misconduct of any kind, end quote. The organization also agreed to a permanent civil injunction barring it from receiving classified information from any state or local employee who is prohibited from sharing it. In other words, Rochelle writes, the ADL is perfectly innocent, but had to promise to never do it again. So, not surprisingly, members of the organization and individuals who were targeted by the ADL spy operation were highly upset. So, there was a coalition of nearly 100 groups spied on by the ADL, who, in October 1993, they held a press conference, and they predicted that there would be a lenient settlement. That prediction came to pass. You had the Coalition Against Surveillance. They had been told by anonymous sources that a sweetheart deal was in the making, and they called it a great disservice to the thousands of victims of the ADL's spy operation. And Christine Toda, who at that time was the secretary of the Arab American Caucus of California Democratic Party, said the settlement, quote, made a mockery of the justice system. You can bet that if it was an Arab American organization that behaved this way, it would have been tried, prosecuted, and hung, end quote. She's not wrong. She's not wrong at all. So, after the settlement was announced on November 17th, 1993, 20 members of the coalition of California Democrats walked in the ADL's San Francisco office. They asked for a conference with the officials. They weren't allowed to enter. They were not allowed to make an appointment. The ADL called the police. So ultimately the ADL didn't suffer any consequence for what they did then, and they're not going to suffer any consequence now. Because guess what? The interests that they represent have compromised a lot of people in our government. They've compromised a staggering number of officials in our government, both elected, appointed, and people within the permanent deep state. And it is the permanent bureaucracy that stays that way regardless of who's in office or who has control of Congress. So the ADL can sit here, even though the optics are bad and the Sinai Temple took Jonathan Greenblatt's speech down, the footage of it, ultimately nothing's going to happen to them. They can spy on you with impunity. They can monitor your speech. They can harass you through lawfare for that speech if they deem that speech anti-Semitic. And they can do so with impunity. They did it back in 1993. They were bribing the police to obtain confidential files. They were infiltrating organizations that they thought might be anti-Semitic or that they disagreed with. So ultimately, you will see this continue as long as it's tolerated. You'll see this type of just blatant anti-Goyism to invert what they say, continuing on and on and on until the rest of us who aren't Christian Zionists, the rest of us who aren't Zionist Americans at all, who just believe that everybody is created in the image of God, Jews included, and who believe that everyone in a secular, pluralistic society should have the same rights, the same obligations, get up and say, we've had enough of this. We have had enough of this shit. We've had enough of you sabotaging our society from within to remake it socially in whatever image you want, so that a 24-year-old can have sex with a 14-year-old boy or girl and not wind up on a sex offender registry. We're tired of you saying that students who were raped by their teachers were having sexual relationships with those teachers. No, they were not. Students don't have relationships with teachers because they're children. And the teacher is an adult. On top of that, the teacher determines what kind of grade they get. The teacher wields enormous disciplinary power over their students, and they can leverage that power in an exploitative way. That's why we have those boundaries between teachers and students. That's why we outlaw that kind of behavior, not just between adult and child, but especially between teacher and student, because there's not another student in the classroom who can trust in the validity of their grades, and they're in competition with somebody who is boning their teacher. Like, they can't trust that that teacher's going to fairly grade other people's assignments. The disparity is there not only in terms of exploiting the victim who's being raped by the teacher, but also in terms of how the teacher teaches or treats the other students in the classroom. That's the reality of this situation. And the rest of us are getting our fill of it. It is been passed into law, it was signed by President Trump, that the Epstein files were to be released. 1% of those files have been released so far. It was the law 30 years ago that the JFK files, or the files regarding JFK's assassination, were to be released. They haven't been released. Like, it's pure window dressing. And for those of us who oppose child sexual exploitation and child sexual abuse, child rape, we're a little peeved. And the consistent thread in all of this, the Epsteins, those who own pornography sites and who are marketing porn towards our children, whose average age of first exposure to pornography has now dropped to 10 years of age. The people who are pushing this whole idea that pedophiles, child rapists, are individuals who are minor attracted persons rather than sexual predators. Like, the rest of us are pretty damn tired of it. We're tired of the games. We're tired of the semantics. We're tired of the little passive-aggressive tiptoeing and everything. And our attention and our focus hasn't wavered. We know what's going on. Now, we're figuring out what to do about it as a practical matter and how to handle it. But ultimately, I think a lot of us, an increasing number of us across the political spectrum, are fed up with this. So I'd like to open the forum in my chat to people to ask me questions on this fine Sunday afternoon. Let's see. I started at 11. It's now 11:59. So I've been going for about an hour. To any of my 5 viewers, you can ask me anything about this episode or anything else in the chat. So let's see if you're paying attention, you want to ask me a question in the chat. you can do so, and I'll answer it to the best of my abilities. I am dry mouthed and thirsty. So let's see here. Let's see what we come up with in terms of a Q&A session. Well, any questions in the next few minutes? I'm going to close this episode off and go spend time with my lovely wife. Probably get a sandwich. All right, guys. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat or elsewhere. Here we go. Richard from La Canada, I am so sorry about that. Have I found any more info on the SRA going on around in this area? Yeah. The problem is that kind of information takes a lot of time to chase down and verify, and to nail it down cold, so that I don't get sued or accused of sloppy journalism. So I am still actively digging into La Canada and other places. The other issue here is the sheer amount or sheer volume of tips that I have coming in at any given time, and the fact that I run AntiTribe, government sex predators, and our IRA. So I am quite busy. I have a wife. I have a job. I have a dog. She's somewhere around here. In terms of the Hamlin sisters being okay these days, given what happened to Emily Sheets, I don't imagine that they are. That was their childhood friend. That was another opportunity to put their father behind bars for being a sexual predator. And we know he's a sexual predator because he apologized on a recorded line to his daughter for raping her. His exact words were, "I am sorry for raping you," to Catherine Hamlin. That's up on IRA. That audio is up on IRA. So moving on, Richard says Rachel Hamlin was in his home ward when he was young. One of the odd things is how this coexists alongside regular Mormonism. And you don't know what's going on because you're not part of the club. You're not invited to these home ordinances or Bible studies because you're from a quote lesser bloodline, or they just don't consider you as someone who can add to the group in terms of your financial resources or your reputation. So yeah, I can believe that Rachel Hamlin was in your home ward with her husband Tyler Jones when you were young, and you probably didn't see anything because your family probably wasn't what these individuals in all of their conceited outlook consider to be a royal bloodline. So we have Chapster 85. There is a history of SRA across the globe, but it's really prevalent in Scotland. Do you think that influenced David Levitt to move there? That and the fact that there was a lot of heat on him in Utah. He needed to get out of the country, and he needed to wait for things to die down and for the Hamlin case to be resolved. And so he went to Scotland. He bought Knockderry Castle. In order to change the narrative, he started a social media channel on Instagram detailing him and his wife's efforts to remodel a 19th century castle. And he's been largely successful at changing the story or changing the narrative. SRA does appear to be prevalent in Scotland and in places like Australia and New Zealand. Not just in the United States, but in those areas. And the common theme that I've uncovered is in areas where Freemasonry is prevalent or where a Masonic organization, and make no mistake about it, the church that I used to be a part of, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, has all the grips and code words and keys that Masonry has. It was lifted directly plagiarized from Masonry. One of the big areas of concern, in addition to investigating allegations, is where this started. Like where ritual abuse started within the LDS and beforehand. And what I would say to you is Freemasonry, once you get up in the degrees from what I've seen, is Kabbalah for Gentiles. So you have a situation where the Church of Satan Mormons aren't necessarily Freemasons because officially the church had a falling out with Freemasonry in Nauvoo because the Illinois Grand Lodge was upset at how fast the Nauvoo Mormons were moving people to the first 4 degrees of Masonry. They didn't feel like they were taking it seriously. They were rushing them through those first 3 degrees, in some cases 4 degrees in a weekend's time, or in a couple of weeks' time. And this offended the Illinois Grand Lodge, which ultimately moved to attempt to revoke the charter of the Nauvoo Masons, who were Mormon. Of course, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball had been Mormon before Nauvoo, I believe. And I know Heber was. But ultimately, there was tension there. That tension carried over into Utah, and in Utah, a lot of Gentiles were Freemasons. That is, in Utah, there was a substantial Congregationalist population. That was a denomination that was the alternative to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Those Gentiles kind of built a parallel society alongside Mormon culture during the 19th and early 20th century. That's where you get these organizations like the Alta Club and so on and so forth. And then you get individuals who are kind of split. That is, one branch of the family was Mormon and one branch of the family was Protestant or Catholic. A good example of that in the Church of Satan is the Kelly family. Lincoln Kevin Kelly, who appears in the Hamlin victim statements and who worked with purported LDS High Council Punisher Gordon Bowen. His father was a Freemason. And his father ultimately, I wrote about it in my series, The Split Vine, on IRA. His father eventually came back to Mormonism. His father had sponsored his grandchildren on their missions and so on and so forth to help fund those missions. But his father was, like, I think a 31st degree Mason. And of course his grandfather, Lincoln Kevin Kelly's grandfather, was a high-ranking Freemason. Both of them, both the father and the grandfather, I believe they ran an accountancy firm. Both the father and the grandfather were members of the Royal Order of Jesters, which I believe is only available to those who progress to the 30th degree of Masonry. And the Royal Order of Jesters, if you know anything about the criminal cases against them, for sex trafficking and the things that came out about what they're actually up to, you start to see it in a different light in terms of like the implications for Lincoln Kevin Kelly, his grandfather and father, being involved in that organization, being involved in Freemasonry and Order of the Eastern Star. You have any other questions? So Chapster is the last question, it looks like. I'll give you a few more seconds to come up with something. About 70 minutes in. All right. That concludes our... Oh, wait a sec. Here we go. We have Richard. Richard is back. Altadena and Pasadena have a lot of occult esoteric presence. With Jack Parsons, the Rocket Man, Ordo Templis Orientis, and some affiliation overlap with Scientology. It's been interesting to learning about those occulted ties to some Mormon families. I mean, one of Michael Aquino's wives came from a Mormon family, I believe. So there's Temple of Set and the actual LaVeyan Church of Satan overlap there. Do you agree that there are a ton of similarities between Mormon rituals and Freemason rituals? It seems like Joseph Smith co-opted a lot from Freemasonry. I hope that doesn't come across as offensive. I'm impossible to offend, generally speaking, unless you rape a kid or an adult. You have to sexually assault somebody to piss me off, or you have to physically attack me. Yeah, I mean, it's verbatim in certain ordinances. The grips, the names, like the nail, so on and so forth. That's all directly lifted off of Mormon ritual. Did Joseph Smith co-opt a lot from Freemasonry? Sure, he co-opted a lot from Kabbalah in terms of his theosophy. If you were to look at his most famous sermon, the King Follett sermon, the theosophy in that is directly lifted off of Kabbalah and the Zohar. Like, his explication of the nature of God in the King Follett sermon comes directly from the Zohar. That's something that others like Owens have noted in their scholarship on the King Follett sermon. The language and the phrasing is identical. Smith was, in fact, a plagiarist of the highest order. There was a Latter-day Saint of Jewish descent named Niebuhr. He came to Nauvoo. He did like a filling because he was a dentist by trade. He had originally trained as a rabbi and then switched to become a dentist. And he had been retained by Joseph Smith to do some fillings, some dental work for him. And he also began teaching Joseph Smith about the concepts that he knew as a former rabbinical student and from the library that he had. And we know this because there was an article written by this individual in Times and Seasons that referenced at least a dozen Kabbalistic sources. So what I would say is he didn't just co-opt from Freemasonry. He plagiarized from Freemasonry pretty extensively, but he also plagiarized from the Talmud and from the Kabbalah, like Zohar, so on and so forth. He was anything but original towards the end of his life. In terms of early life, I would say between 1800 and 1833. Yes, he may have had some inspiration from God, but if you read the 1833 Book of Commandments, Section 4, Joseph is instructed, if you believe that this is actually divinely inspired revelation, he's instructed to pretend to have no other gift because God will give him no other gift save translating the book. And that language gets changed around, I believe, by the addition of like 21 or 22 additional words in 1835. And the rough paraphrase of it is that Joseph will have no other gift until after he translates the Book of Mormon. The problem is the church as an institution has lied so much about its history and refuses to be transparent about the resources it has, and turn those resources over for independent examination. So we really don't know what happened. And they lack all credibility because of that as an institution when it comes to their history. On top of that, they just lack all credibility because they're covering up sexual abuse and enabling sexual abuse to occur. So that's kind of what this church has become. I do believe that there is a religion within the religion, and that the innermost circle of the Latter-day Saints understands what that religion is. And that religion is ultimately the restoration of Temple Judaism, replete with animal sacrifice and the rituals of, or at least the rituals they believe to be Old Testament rituals, replete with sacrifices. And I've gone into some depth about that on IRA, with respect to quotes in Wilford Woodruff's journal from Brigham Young saying that there's an altar to be built in the Salt Lake Temple for sacrifices. And of course there are some records, extemporaneous records from the Nauvoo period, in which Joseph Smith says that in order to ordain a new member of the Quorum of the 12, they should sacrifice a goat. And then, of course, there's dairy entries from the Andrus couple, in which they talk about Smith saying that temple sacrifices would be restored. The King Follett sermon, clearly influenced by the Zohar and clearly lifts from the Zohar, which is Kabbalistic, which is a form of sex magic. It's a cult, and it's satanic. Fact that he's borrowing that language to describe the nature of God, and that language forms the foundation for all of Mormon cosmology and all of Mormon belief about the nature of God, I think speaks volumes. So we are at 77 minutes in. I think I'll try to get on a little bit later tonight and do another Ask Me Anything or question and answer session, either tonight or tomorrow. It's a 3-day weekend. Let me know what you think. You can reach me at goel@investigationsandritualabuse.com. And, if you have tips, if you have information, you can reach me there. Or you can leave me a message on Substack. I'll talk to you guys later. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. I am going to get something to eat because my blood sugar is clearly crashing. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The next episode that I do will be IRA focused, and it will involve some topics that are near and dear to the Hamlin case. I will talk to you later. God bless. Enjoy.